Proposition 33. This prohibits the state from placing limitations on local rent control. And this, like the last proposition that I talked about, this one got on the ballot through the initiative process. It didn't go through the California legislature. Somebody got enough verified signatures and it was placed on the ballot. So that's how this got on. And Proposition 34, 35, and 36 also use the initiative process to get on the ballot. So what would the policy changes be if Proposition 33 passes? Currently, rent control cannot be applied to single-family homes or housing units built after February 1st, 1995. Additionally, local rent control laws can't limit how much a landlord charges when a new tenant moves in. This means that landlords can reset the rent to market levels, whatever the market will bear when a unit becomes vacant. If Proposition 33 passes, what will happen is first, local governments would have the authority to apply rent control to any type of housing, including single-family homes. Additionally, they could expand rent control to newer properties, so the current limitation on housing after February 1995 would be rescinded, and local governments could regulate how much landlords could increase rent when a tenant moves in to a rent-controlled area. In terms of the local government's flexibility, while the proposition repeals state-imposed limits that were passed by the legislature, it doesn't automatically expand rent control across the state. Instead, it would allow local governments, cities, and counties to decide whether or not to expand or enact rent control policies. Local governments would be able to set limits based on their own local concerns. For renters, what this would do potentially is for renters living in units covered by rent control, they would likely see lower rent increases over time. At the same time, this could make housing more affordable for many renters, especially in cities that have high housing costs. For landlords, since rent control policies could reduce profits, the proposition could lead some landlords to sell their rental properties or convert them into owner-occupied units instead. Right? And this could potentially reduce the availability of rental housing. And then in terms of property values, the value of rental properties could go down because buyers might be less willing to pay high prices for rental properties that have strict rent control policies attached to them. In terms of the state level limits on rent control, Proposition 33 also includes a provision that would prevent the state government from taking future action to limit or preempt local rent control laws, so the state wouldn't be able to override them. This would give local governments control over rent control, making it difficult for future state legislation to enforce statewide limits on rent control policies. What is the fiscal impact? Well, one is that there could be a decline in property values. Proposition 33 could lead to a reduction in the value of rental properties that are subjected to rent control, as potential landlords may not want to invest in properties where there are limits on how much they can charge for rent. This reduction in property values could result in lower property tax revenue for local governments, including cities, counties, special districts, and schools. In terms of its estimated impact, the decline in property tax revenues is estimated to be at least tens of millions of dollars annually, though this is expected to be less than 0.5% of the total tax property revenue that the state takes in. About half of this reduction would affect schools, potentially requiring the state to provide more funds to schools to make up for the lost local revenue. There may also be some increased local costs, local government costs associated with it. Expanding rent control laws would likely result in an increased cost for local governments, as they would need to administer and then enforce new rules, and as a result of the expanded rent control properties policies. It could also involve establishing or expanding local rent control boards, conducting regular inspections, and addressing disputes between landlords and tenants, all which would cost additional money. Now, these costs could range from a few $1 million to tens of $1 millions annually, depending on the scale of local rent control policies. But any costs are going to be, at least for enforcing rent control, would be incurred by the landlords. Expanding rent control could also discourage developers from building new rental properties, right? Rental housing. This slowdown in construction might limit future property tax growth for local governments. However, the size of the impact is uncertain, according to the legislative analyst, and depends on how much local governments expand rent control. Now, if local property tax revenues decrease due to the reduced value of rental properties, the state might need to provide additional funds to schools to meet the funding requirements at the local level. In terms of the fiscal impact on renters and landlords, the fiscal impact on individual renters and landlords will vary, right? Some renters will benefit from the lower rent increases, right? Others may face higher rents in areas without rent control as demand for rent control properties increase. For landlords, reduced rental income may lead to less investment in property maintenance and upgrades, potentially reducing the overall quality of the rental housing stock, because they're not going to want to put as much money into upkeep if they're not going to get a return on their investment. The arguments in favor of Proposition 33 go like this. Proposition 33 is a necessary tool to combat skyrocketing rental prices in California. By expanding rent control, it would make housing more affordable for millions of renters who are struggling to keep up with the high cost of rents, especially in cities where there's severe housing shortages. Proposition 33 empowers local governments to decide what type of rent control laws are best for their communities without state-imposed restrictions. Expanding rent control will also provide greater security for long-term tenants, particularly seniors and low-income families, because they're the ones who are most vulnerable to displacement when rents increase. And then finally, rent control is seen as a measure to go ahead and reduce housing inequality by ensuring that more Californians, particularly those in lower income brackets, can afford stable housing, which is fundamental to overall well-being. The arguments against Proposition 33 are as follows. Expanding rent control will reduce incentives for developers to build new rental housing. Rent control limits the potential for profit, which could exacerbate California's housing shortage by discouraging investment in new housing projects. Also, rent control will lead to a decline in the quality of rental housing, as landlords have fewer incentives to invest in property upkeep and repairs due to the limited rental income. This could ultimately hurt renters by increasing substandard living. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to advance that there. It also could have a negative impact, which could lead to a decline in rental property values, reducing property tax revenues for local governments. These taxes fund important services like school and public safety. And then finally, smaller independent landlords who own only a few rental units might struggle to absorb the financial impact of rent control. These landlords could be forced to sell their units, potentially reducing the number of available rental units. In terms of the people who support and oppose this one is a little more interesting than some of the other ones because it doesn't break completely across party lines. The California Republican Party recommends a no vote. The California Republican Party recommends a no vote. The California Democratic Party recommends a yes vote. The Chamber of Commerce recommends a no vote. The California Labor Federation recommends a yes vote. And that's pretty much what we would expect. But both the Los Angeles Times, which tends to be more liberal, recommends a no vote, and the Los Angeles Daily News, which tends to be conservative, recommends a no vote as well. So it's a little bit more mixed of a signal of the 6 organizations that we are tracking when we're doing these propositions. So a yes vote supports allowing citizens and counties to enact rent control and prohibiting the state from limiting the right of any city or county to maintain, enact, or expand rent control. A no vote opposes allowing cities and counties to enact rent control. And I'm sorry for the typo on this.